Hello and welcome to the first unit in this module on animal form and function. In our first unit, we're going to be looking at some basic principles, and these include just a brief introduction, looking at primary tissues which we find in organisms, considering different body plans and the concept of homeostasis and the importance of metabolic rate. As you know, this module is called Animal Form and Function. And what that also can be translated into is the anatomy or the form of the animal, as well as the physiology or the function of these structures. And that really is the focus of this module. And throughout all your units, I want you to remember this and try to link the form and functions that you are considering. Another way we can look at this is to consider the correlation between the structure and the function of that structure, and how these enable the organism to function optimally. As we've said, form fits functions, but not only in a whole organism as you might consider it if you looked, for example, at a cow in a field. In this module, we'll be diving deeper and we'll even look down to the tissue level and in some cases even a cellular level. At every level, we will see that the form of the structure is going to fit its function, and that this knowledge will provide insight into how these work together to optimize an organism's functioning. Another way we can look at it is knowing the structure's function, we could then infer what we might expect in terms of form. All organisms essentially need to follow 4 critical processes, which in turn can be divided into 2 groups. These are obtaining certain things and disposing of certain things. Every organism needs to obtain oxygen and also energy and various materials. Every organism needs to dispose of carbon dioxide and also of nitrogenous waste, and this might be in the form of urea, ammonia, or uric acid, for example. There are many different animal body plans that have evolved, and each one is determined by the genome. The size and shape affect the way that the animal will interact with the environment. And these are largely governed by physical laws of strength, diffusion, movement, and heat exchange. And these laws can possibly impose constraints on the size and the shape of the animal. It's for this reason that we don't have exceptionally large invertebrate organisms living on land, for example, because they simply would not have the structural support to hold such a large body with the effects of gravity on land, for example. And so in general, the largest invertebrates are usually found in aquatic environments. The ability to perform certain actions depends on the animal's shape, size, and environment. The evolutionary convergence reflects how different species have adapted to a similar environmental exchange. And here we can see how limbs in different organisms have evolved in different ways. Now I want you to think carefully about whether or not this is reflecting convergence. Please, after watching this video, spend some time on the definition of convergence and divergence and make sure you are comfortable with these terms. If you have any questions, you can post them on the discussion forum. But this image here reflects what we mean by convergent evolution. Here you can see we have a bird, a fish, and a mammal. Each one has essentially evolved the same body plan to optimize its functioning within an aquatic environment. In other words, a similar structure has come together or converged in different groups of animals. This is what we mean by convergent evolution. So how are these materials exchanged with the environment? Remember, we mentioned that every organism needs to obtain and dispose of various substances. Materials such as nutrients and waste products all need to exchange across a cell membrane, and the rate of exchange is proportional to a cell surface area, and the amount of exchange is proportional to the cell's volume. Now this is a very important concept because again, these physical laws are going to dictate the structure of organisms because they place limits on the rate and the amount of the exchange which can take place within an organism. Here we can see a cube which has equal length, breadth, and height, each of 5 centimeters. I want you to imagine that this is an organism. a unicellular organism that is cube-shaped? Can you calculate the surface area? And can you calculate its volume? Now this is very important because you need to be able to understand how volume will change in proportion to a change in surface area, because again, these important physical properties are going to determine how these organisms function and the various structures that they might need to evolve to optimize their survival. We're going to look at calculating surface area to volume ratio in our first practical, so I won't spend too much time on that. You should also have covered that in your high school mathematics. Here we can see a graphic representation of 3 cubes, and again I want you to imagine that these are 3 different organisms, each organism with a different width. In cube 1 you can see that it has a height of 1 centimeter, and because this is a cube, all sides will have equal distances. In cube 2 you can see that it has increased to 2 centimeters, and in the third cube you can see that this has increased to 4 centimeters. In each cube, as we progress, we can see that this height has doubled. But instead of the volume also doubling, we can see that this is not the case. To calculate the surface area of a cube, you first calculate the surface area of one side, and in this case, the first one is 1 times 1, or length times breadth, and that gives us the surface area of the side that's facing us. But remember that a cube has 6 sides, and so each of these values needs to be multiplied by 6, as you can see here in the image. To calculate the volume, you need to calculate the length times the breadth times the height. And you can see here that that renders quite a different answer to the surface area. Now to make these comparable and understand how the surface area to volume ratio changes as you change the size of your organism, you need to reach a comparable ratio or fraction. And in this case, we always try to get the surface area to volume ratio to have a ratio relative to 1 unit of volume. In other words, the first one is for every 1 unit of volume, there are 6 units of surface area. For the next one, cube of 2 centimeters, you can see that for a cube with a surface area 24 centimeters squared, we have 8 centimeters cubed in terms of volume. But this is very difficult to compare to the above value of 6 to 1. And so we divide the volume of 8 by 8 to get an answer of 1. And we do the same to the surface area. So 24 divided by 8 gives us 3. In other words, for every 1 unit of volume, we have 3 units of surface area. The same can be done for the last cube. Here they've presented the answer as 3 to 2, and this makes it again a bit more difficult to compare to the others, and so you can take it further and have a fraction of an answer, in other words, an answer of 1.5 to 1. This is also acceptable, and it's a lot easier to compare these cubes when all the volumes are equal. When you do this, you can see that the largest cube of 4 centimeters has a very small surface area for every unit of volume. And this has very important implications when we consider those physical laws we were talking about and how the rate and the amount of diffusion is going to be influenced by this phenomenon. An animal's size and shape will directly affect how it's going to exchange energy and materials with its surroundings. Now remember, these exchange processes can occur in a variety of ways. These can be using energy or active processes or passive processes, for example, diffusion. And again, you would have covered a lot of these concepts in your first year biology. When considering a unicellular organism, you can see that this has direct exchange with the environment. This is because it is a single cell living with sufficient plasma membrane or surface area to service the entire volume of the cytoplasm within the cell. In other words, there is enough surface area in contact with the environment in order to obtain the necessary materials as well as dispose of wastes. What about multicellular organisms that are fairly simple? there are only 2 layers of cells which form the body. In other words, diffusion can still take place relatively easy, and it has the sac body plan, which allows a lot of movement of water through the body to carry the materials to bring it into contact with these cells. Where multicellular organisms do not have a sac-like body plan, where it can have sufficient exchange with the environment both externally and internally, you'll find that these organisms are very flat. Again, this is a way of increasing the surface area of that organism to have sufficient contact with the environment to service the volume that is present in the organism. More complex organisms are composed of complex and compact masses of cells and various internal organization levels. They have evolutionary adaptations and specialized extensive branches which will fold and create increased surface areas to service the volume within the organism. And we're going to be looking at these systems in more detail in this module. Here we can see an example of such a multicellular organism, and this is a very basic organism, but still depicting the various systems which have had to evolve to create sufficient surface area to allow for enough exchange for the volume of the organism. And so we see the development of these complex systems. We have a respiratory system where the alveoli, for example, have become very small and very thin to allow for sufficient exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. We have an excretory system where we find kidneys with large masses of microscopic tubules, again allowing for sufficient exchange and diffusion of materials. The digestive system has numerous villi and microvilli, which are finger-like projections, again increasing surface area to allow for sufficient exchange of materials. And we can go on and on with all our systems, but I want you to remember these basic principles that we're learning now as you learn more about these systems throughout the module. In vertebrates, the space between the cells is filled with interstitial fluid, and this means that there is movement of material between cells in this fluid. And a complex body plan will help an animal in a variable environment to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. And again, we'll learn more about the importance of these stable internal environments as we move through this module. As we've mentioned, there are various levels of organization. We can consider the smallest level of a cell. We've seen that some organisms are made up of one cell, while others are very complex and multicellular with lots of systems in place to service the organism. And so we need to remember this when discussing these systems, tissues, and cells, and what their roles are in optimizing the function. In a multicellular organism, we will still find differences at a cellular level. Cells which are involved in high energy demanding processes might have more mitochondria, for example, than cells which are not involved with high energy demanding processes. And so when you consider your systems and when you're discussing these various adaptations, you can discuss them at an organ system, an organ, a tissue, or a cellular level. Please also remember that there are other levels of organization, but for the purposes of this module, we really will be focusing from a cellular to an organism level. But we mustn't forget that these organisms in turn need to interact with their environments, and their environments will also influence the structures that we see evolved in these organisms. And so there is a highly linked and interactive process taking place. We mustn't compartmentalize the information that we learn.